5 true scary stories of dark family secrets you won't believe. The Whitmore estate had always been an imposing sight, nestled deep in the rolling hills of rural New England, its towering stone walls darkened with age and ivy. Generations had come and gone, but the mansion remained, its windows like dark eyes that seemed to watch those who approached. Despite its grandeur, there was an oppressive weight to the place, a sense of foreboding that had always lingered in the air. Michael Whitmore, now a middle-aged man, hadn't set foot in this house for over 2 decades. Yet, it felt as though he had never left. The estate had belonged to his family for over 300 years, each generation passing it on to the next, their lives intertwined with the very walls that surrounded them. But with each passing generation, something darker had begun to creep into the corners of the house. Michael had never believed the rumors of ghosts or curses, not when he was young at least. But the sudden death of his father, a man he barely knew, had forced his return. His father had died unexpectedly in a quiet, undramatic way. A heart attack, the doctor said. No warning, just gone. The call had come in the dead of night, and within hours, Michael was on a plane back to the place he swore he'd never return to. The mansion greeted him with cold, empty silence. The front door creaked as he pushed it open, its hinges protesting against the intrusion. The air inside was thick with dust and the musty scent of wood and time. Every step Michael took through the house felt like a betrayal. Every echo of his footsteps made him feel more like an intruder than a son. He had come here to handle his father's estate, to settle whatever business was left. But as he wandered through the long, dimly lit hallways, it wasn't the inheritance that gripped him. It was the house itself. It was as though the walls were holding on to something buried beneath their surface, whispering faintly in the back of his mind. Michael didn't know it yet, but those whispers would soon grow louder. His father's study was at the end of a long corridor. The room was exactly as Michael remembered it. The same old wooden desk cluttered with papers, the dusty shelves lined with books his father never read, and the large portrait of a stern-faced man that loomed over the room like a silent judge. This room had always been off-limits when he was a child, his father's private sanctuary. But now it felt strangely inviting, as if the secrets it held were beckoning him. He approached the desk, his hands lingering over the items that had once belonged to the man he never truly knew. A cracked leather chair sat in front of the desk, as though waiting for someone to sit. As Michael moved the papers aside, his eyes fell on something he hadn't noticed before, a leather-bound journal, worn and weathered, with no name on the cover. It was almost as though it had been waiting for him. Michael hesitated for a moment, then opened the journal. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. His great-grandfather's handwriting sprawled across the pages, filled with strange notations, cryptic phrases, and accounts of events that seemed impossible. At first, he thought it was simply the ramblings of a man long gone. But as he read on, something in the entries stirred a feeling of dread deep in his chest. The journal spoke of the Whitmore family's history, a legacy of strange occurrences dating back centuries. Each generation, it seemed, had its own horror, a haunting, a tragedy, or a dark secret that had festered in the shadows of the family home. The journal was filled with accounts of inexplicable happenings, whispers in the walls, objects moving on their own, strange figures glimpsed in the corners of rooms. His great-grandfather had written of an ancient curse that seemed to follow the Whitmore bloodline, one that grew stronger with each passing year. As Michael read, the room around him seemed to grow colder. The air grew thick, and the house itself seemed to sigh, a deep, mournful sound that resonated through the walls. His heart began to race, his breath quickening as he turned the pages. There, near the end of the journal, a chilling phrase caught his eye. "The house will always remember, and so shall we." It was at that moment, as the last light of day faded into twilight, that Michael felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Slowly, he turned his head, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the study. For a moment, everything was still. Then, from the corner of the room, he saw it, a shadow, shifting unnaturally, as if it were more than just a trick of the light. Michael's blood ran cold. He stood frozen, the journal still in his hands, as the shadow seemed to move closer. There was no sound, only the oppressive weight of something ancient and forgotten pressing in around him. The whispers in the walls grew louder, and Michael felt a deep, gut-wrenching sense of dread, the kind that comes when you realize something is not only watching you, but is waiting for you to understand. It was in that moment that Michael knew. His return to the Whitmore estate was not merely a homecoming. It was the beginning of something far darker, a confrontation with the terrifying legacy his family had been hiding for centuries. And it would be a confrontation he could not avoid. Story 1. The Ghostly Ancestor. The estate had always felt haunted, but it was never more than a vague discomfort in the back of Michael's mind. As he explored the mansion's vast, decaying halls, an unsettling feeling gnawed at him. A feeling that the house had long outlived its purpose. A feeling that it was more than just a building. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing, remembering. But what it remembered, Michael couldn't yet say. One evening, while searching through the attic for any old letters or documents his father may have left behind, Michael stumbled across something that stopped him cold. An old portrait, hidden behind layers of dust and forgotten relics. The woman in the portrait was a striking figure, dressed in an elegant black gown with a face that was hauntingly familiar, yet disturbingly foreign. Her eyes, cold, calculating, and unervingly intense, seemed to follow him as he approached. He couldn't help but feel as if she was staring directly at him, knowing him. But that wasn't what disturbed him the most. It was the name written underneath the portrait, Eliza Whitmore. Her beauty was undeniable, but there was an air of something dark about her, something Michael couldn't quite grasp. Why had this portrait been hidden away? And why did it feel so wrong? Curiosity led Michael to do some research on Eliza, and soon he learned that she was his great-great-grandmother, a woman of considerable influence in the early days of the Whitmore family. Eliza had been an enigmatic figure, loved by some and feared by others. The more Michael read, the more questions arose. Rumors surrounding Eliza's life painted a sinister portrait of a woman accused of witchcraft, a charge that had led to her execution on the very grounds of the estate. A dark chapter in the Whitmore family's history that had been all but erased from the records. Late that night, as the wind howled outside, Michael found himself alone in the study once more, surrounded by the oppressive silence of the mansion. He had convinced himself the stories were just that, stories, part of the legacy of a family that had been built on superstition and fear. But as the hours stretched on, he began to hear something, whispers soft and indistinct, as if coming from the very walls themselves. He stood still, straining to listen, his heart hammering in his chest. At first, he thought it was the house settling, the old timbers creaking under the pressure of the night. But then, there it was again, a soft, almost imperceptible sound like footsteps echoing in the distance. He turned toward the hallway, but there was nothing there. The house was empty. Yet, the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more distinct, and Michael could have sworn he heard his name being whispered in the dark. Michael! A chill washed over him as the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and the shadows around him shifted, as if alive, writhing in the corners of the room. He instinctively reached for the portrait of Eliza on the nearby wall, his eyes drawn to it once more. The air felt thick, charged with something unseen. That night, sleep did not come easily. The whispers continued, now accompanied by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, faint but growing nearer. And then, in the dark, he saw her. A figure, pale and translucent, stood at the foot of his bed. Michael's breath caught in his throat as the figure slowly came into focus. It was Eliza, her features sharp and angular, her eyes burning with an intensity that seemed to pierce his very soul. She was no longer a mere portrait. She was real, a living ghost, and she was staring at him with an unsettling gaze that made his blood run cold. Michael's pulse raced as Eliza's ghost reached out to him, her hands like ice as they brushed against his skin. He recoiled in horror, but she didn't let go. She whispered his name, her voice low and echoing in his ears. "Michael, you cannot escape what has been set in motion." The next few days brought more disturbing encounters. Michael couldn't shake the feeling that Eliza was always watching, always near. The house seemed to shift with her presence. Rooms that were once warm now felt freezing cold, shadows flickered unnaturally, and the walls seemed to hum with a strange energy. No matter where he went, Eliza's ghost seemed to follow him, appearing at the edge of his vision, standing just beyond his reach. In an effort to understand what was happening, Michael delved deeper into his family's history, searching for answers. What he uncovered was a chilling truth. Eliza's curse had been passed down through the generations. The journal he had found in his father's study revealed that after her execution, Eliza had vowed revenge on the Whitmore family, cursing each new generation with torment and misfortune. The curse was bound to the estate, and every Whitmore born into the family was destined to suffer. With each passing day, the encounters with Eliza grew more intense. Her presence became impossible to ignore. One evening, Michael found himself standing before the portrait of his great-great-grandmother again. He stared at her eyes, feeling the weight of her hatred pressing down on him. The whispers were deafening now, their meaning unmistakable. "You cannot escape." Desperation set in as Michael realized that the only way to end the curse, to break free from the haunting legacy of Eliza, was to confront her, to confront the truth of what she had done to his family. But what Eliza demanded from him was a price too high. One final encounter brought Michael face to face with the ghost of his great-great-grandmother. She appeared in the middle of the night, her form more solid than ever, her eyes burning with fury. "You must choose, Michael," she whispered, her voice filled with ancient bitterness. "You can break the curse, but only at the cost of your life. You will become part of this house, trapped here forever, or you can let the curse continue, and the Whitmore family will never know peace." Michael's heart pounded in his chest as he stood in the presence of the specter. He thought of the family he had left behind, of the mansion that had once been a symbol of pride and legacy. But he also thought of the suffering that had been passed down through the generations. With trembling hands, Michael made his choice. The moment he spoke, the air grew still, the whispers fading into silence. He had broken the curse, but as the last remnants of Eliza's presence faded into nothingness, Michael felt himself weaken, his body becoming a part of the house. In the end, he had freed his family from the torment, but at a cost. The Whitmore estate was no longer just a family home. It was a graveyard where the ghosts of the past would forever be bound to its walls. And Michael, now a part of that haunting legacy, would never escape. Story 2. The Cursed Family Legacy. Michael's search for answers about his family's haunted history led him deeper into the mansion, into the very heart of its long-forgotten secrets. One afternoon, as he combed through his father's study, he came across an old chest tucked away in a corner of the room. The chest was ornate, with intricate carvings of vines and symbols that Michael couldn't recognize. It had been hidden behind old papers, likely forgotten by his father. As he opened the chest, a sense of dread washed over him. Inside, wrapped in a faded velvet cloth, was an item that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, a silver pocket watch. Michael could feel the weight of it, not just physically, but emotionally, as though the very air had thickened around him. He held the watch in his hand, inspecting its delicate engravings. The silver surface was tarnished, but the intricate pattern of vines and symbols on its face was unmistakable. It was part of the family legacy, a piece of history passed down from one generation to the next. But as he turned the watch over, a chill ran down his spine. Engraved on the back was a name, Edward Whitmore. Michael knew the name. It was his great-great-uncle, a man whose life had been shrouded in mystery and tragedy. He had died under strange circumstances, his death a subject of whispered rumors among the older generations of the family. It was said that Edward had never spoken of his passing, and his name was rarely mentioned in the family's history. Michael's hands trembled as he recalled the old family lore. The pocket watch had been passed down to each Whitmore male in succession, each one inheriting it upon coming of age. But with each passing, tragedy struck. Accidents, betrayals, sudden deaths, all of them inexplicably tied to the watch. The more Michael thought about it, the more he realized that the watch, rather than being a symbol of family pride, seemed to have become a curse, one that had followed the Whitmore bloodline for generations. As he stood there, holding the watch, Michael's mind raced. He could feel something shifting in the air, an invisible tension that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. It was as though the watch itself was alive, watching him, waiting. He looked down at the timepiece again, its hands frozen at 11:11, a time that felt oddly significant. Days later, strange things began to happen. Michael noticed that the watch seemed to glow faintly, especially at night, casting an eerie light around his study. The first sign of the curse's power manifested when his distant cousin, Jonathan Whitmore, came to visit the estate. Jonathan was a man of wealth and ambition, someone Michael had always admired, albeit with a sense of cautious detachment. Jonathan was the type of man who believed in his own invincibility, always surrounded by the trappings of success. But as soon as he laid eyes on the watch, something shifted. He asked to hold it, and Michael, despite his growing unease, handed it over. That night, Jonathan was involved in a horrific car accident. The car had crashed into a tree, killing him instantly. The authorities were baffled, unable to explain the cause of the crash. It was as if the universe had conspired against him in that moment. Michael's heart sank. He knew the connection immediately. The watch, it seemed, had claimed another victim. The tragic events only grew worse after that. Friends and family members began to suffer inexplicable misfortunes. A close friend of Michael's, a local historian, died suddenly in what was ruled as an unfortunate accident while researching family records in the mansion's library. The same night, a distant relative, a young woman named Clara Whitmore, was found dead under mysterious circumstances. Her death ruled a suicide, though no one could explain why she would have taken her own life. As each misfortune piled upon the next, Michael became increasingly obsessed with the history of the watch. He delved into family records, speaking with relatives who had tried to forget the dark past. It was then that he uncovered the horrifying truth. The pocket watch had been cursed by his great-great-uncle Edward, a man consumed by rage and betrayal. Edward had been betrayed by a close friend, a fellow businessman who had stolen his fortune, leaving him destitute and broken. In his fury, Edward had sworn vengeance, cursing the watch before he died, ensuring that each generation would face a tragic fate tied to its passing. Michael realized that the watch wasn't just an object. It was a conduit for the pain, anger, and resentment that had been passed down through the generations. Every person who had inherited the watch had become a pawn in a cruel game of fate. The cycle of tragedy had continued for over a century, and now it was Michael's turn to inherit the curse. The thought of breaking the cycle consumed him. But could he? Was it possible to rid himself of the watch without suffering the same fate as those who had come before him? Desperate, Michael took the watch to the mansion's fireplace, planning to destroy it once and for all. But as the flames licked at the silver, the watch remained unscathed, as though mocking his attempts. No matter how hot the fire burned, the watch resisted, its surface unmarked. In his desperation, Michael remembered the old well in the mansion's yard, a place where generations of Whitmore ancestors had been buried. It was said that anything thrown into the well would be lost forever. Perhaps, he thought, the well could destroy the watch. Perhaps it was the only way to end the curse for good. With the watch gripped tightly in his hand, Michael ran through the mansion and out into the yard. The wind howled around him, the night air thick with the promise of tragedy. He reached the well, its dark, gaping mouth calling to him like the maw of some ancient beast. Without hesitation, he tossed the pocket watch into the depths, watching it disappear into the darkness. For a brief moment, there was silence. The winds calmed, the house stood still. Michael felt a fleeting sense of relief, as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. But the relief was short-lived. The following days were filled with more tragedies, more inexplicable events. Michael's life became a waking nightmare, as every time he thought the curse was broken, another misfortune would strike. Friends, neighbors, even strangers, all tied to him, all bound to the legacy of the Whitmore family. The curse had not been lifted. It had simply shifted, changing shape, morphing into something more insidious. It was as if the watch had merely redirected its power, guiding fate toward tragedy. In the end, Michael realized the cruel truth. Some curses, no matter how hard one fights against them, cannot be broken. The cycle of fate had claimed him as it had claimed all those before him. The watch, though destroyed, had merely been a vessel for the curse, and the legacy of vengeance, betrayal, and greed would continue, forever entwined with the Whitmore name. Michael's fate was sealed. There was no escape from the curse of the Whitmore family. Story 3. The Adopted Mystery. The revelation came when Michael was rummaging through his father's old desk, searching for answers, seeking any shred of clarity amidst the confusion of his family's dark legacy. His father had always been distant, a man of few words, but after his death, Michael found himself wanting to understand the man he had known so little. Among old documents and letters, he found something that would shatter the reality he had always known, a birth certificate that was not his own. The document was yellowed with age, the ink faded and illegible in parts, but the name on the top was unmistakable, his name. However, next to it was a different entry, adopted. It took a moment for the words to sink in, and then a wave of disbelief and panic surged through Michael. The father he had known all his life wasn't his biological parent. His bloodline, the roots that tied him to this cursed family, were not what he had believed. The discovery left him reeling, unable to grasp the magnitude of it. The thought of his father being a mere stranger in biological terms felt wrong. But what disturbed him more than the adoption itself was the urgency of the secret. Why had his parents kept it hidden? Why had no one ever mentioned it? It had to mean something, and the more Michael thought about it, the more the pieces of his life began to feel like a puzzle with too many missing parts. He wasn't just Michael Whitmore. He was someone else entirely. In the days that followed, Michael began to question everything. Every memory, every conversation, every interaction with his family now felt tainted by this new truth. The love he thought he had received from his father suddenly felt like a facade. The anger he had felt toward him for years, the distance between them, seemed meaningless now in the face of this betrayal. His identity was crumbling, and he didn't know where to turn. As his mind grappled with the shock, Michael decided to dig deeper. The mansion, with all its dark corners and forgotten spaces, seemed like the perfect place to start. His father had always been protective of the family's past, but now, Michael felt compelled to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. His journey led him to a locked drawer in the study, one his father had kept hidden away for years. Inside, he found a faded police file, thick with dust and years of neglect. The case number on the front was from decades ago, the year his parents had adopted him. As he flipped through the yellowed pages, the details of the report began to take shape. It wasn't just a typical adoption process. No, this file contained something darker, something that had been buried long ago. The name of his birth mother, Caroline Foster, appeared on the file, and the date of her death, listed as a tragic accident, made Michael's stomach churn. The report described a car crash on a desolate road, a crash that claimed her life and the life of her husband, Michael's birth father. The tragic accident had left no survivors, or so it seemed. The deeper Michael delved into the case, the more unsettling the details became. The police investigation was brief, almost non-existent, but there were inconsistencies. The crash had been ruled an accident, but the more Michael read, the clearer it became that someone had tried to bury the truth. Someone had gone to great lengths to make it seem like a tragic but ordinary event, when in fact, there was more to it. The autopsy report revealed that Caroline's injuries did not align with the nature of the crash. The bruising and cuts on her body suggested a struggle, a fight before her death. And the strangest part, the police report mentioned that her husband, Michael's biological father, had been found with a mysterious set of wounds that indicated he had been stabbed. As Michael pieced these clues together, a horrifying thought crossed his mind. His birth parents hadn't died in a simple car accident. They had been murdered. Determined to uncover the truth, Michael began searching through the rest of the file, looking for more clues. What he found next chilled him to the bone. The name of a man who had been present during the investigation, a man with ties to the Whitmore family. The name was familiar. It was his adoptive father's. Michael's heart raced as the pieces fell into place. His adoptive father had been involved in the investigation, and he had helped cover up the murder. The cold truth struck him like a physical blow. His own family had been involved in the death of his birth mother, and in their quest to protect the Whitmore name, they had silenced everything, including the truth about his origins. The realization left Michael paralyzed. His father, the man he had trusted and loved, had not just kept the secret of his adoption, he had concealed a murder. And worse, he had never told Michael the truth about his biological family, leaving him to live a lie. The weight of the betrayal was suffocating. His family's legacy wasn't just one of tragedy, but of corruption and violence. Everything he had known about his family's history, about his own identity, had been carefully crafted to hide the dark, bloody truth that had been buried beneath layers of deception. Michael's investigation took him to more dangerous places, uncovering new details about the crime. But with each discovery, the sense of dread grew stronger. He spoke with old family members, people who had known the truth but had kept their silence out of loyalty to the Whitmore name. One elderly relative, an aunt who had once been close to his father, finally broke her silence. She told Michael that the murder had been a result of a betrayal, a violent confrontation over a business deal gone wrong. His biological father had been targeted, and Caroline had been caught in the crossfire. But the most shocking revelation came from her next words. Your father was involved in the cover-up. He was the one who made sure the police didn't look too closely. He was the one who buried the evidence. Michael's world tilted on its axis. His adoptive father, the man who had loved him, had been part of the very crime that had torn his birth family apart. The realization hit him like a tidal wave, drowning him in guilt and anger. He had never been allowed to know his true identity, and now he was left with the knowledge that the people who raised him had conspired to keep the darkest parts of his history hidden. The investigation didn't bring him peace. It didn't bring him closure. All it did was reveal the ugly truth about the family he had once trusted. Michael Whitmore's past was not his own. It had been stolen, hidden, and buried by the people who should have loved him the most. And as the last pieces of the puzzle came together, Michael understood that the truth, no matter how painful, was the only thing that could set him free, even if it came at the cost of his own family's reputation. In the end, Michael was left with the question that had haunted him from the beginning. Who was he really? And how could he ever reconcile the man he had become with the monstrous secrets of his family's past? Story 4. The Stolen Fortune. Michael had never trusted his Uncle Edgar, but after the unsettling discoveries about his own family's past, a growing suspicion began to gnaw at him. Edgar Whitmore was everything Michael despised in a man. A ruthless businessman, arrogant and calculating, who had amassed a fortune built on manipulation and exploitation. Edgar's vast wealth seemed to overshadow every other aspect of the Whitmore legacy, yet it came with a constant, unsettling sense of unease. The mansion, the estate, the luxury, all of it had been paid for by something dark, something that Michael could not quite place. The more Michael thought about it, the more he felt the presence of something missing, something hidden beneath the polished surface of Edgar's success. Edgar had always been the black sheep of the Whitmore family, someone whose greed and ambition never seemed to fit with the family's more traditional, if still dark, history. But Michael had to admit, Edgar had built an empire, a legacy that seemed almost too perfect to be legitimate. The answer seemed too obvious, yet Michael couldn't shake the feeling that there was a hidden truth behind it all. When he started to look deeper into Edgar's finances, Michael began to unearth something far worse than he had anticipated. Edgar's business dealings, although spectacularly successful, were shrouded in secrecy. Offshore accounts, false company names, and suspiciously timed investments were scattered across documents he found buried in his father's old study. Yet it wasn't just the financial paperwork that piqued Michael's interest. It was the name of a distant relative, Victor Whitmore, that kept appearing in the records. Victor Whitmore was a name that Michael had never heard of before, and as he dug further into the archives, the pieces began to fall into place. According to the documents, Victor had been the rightful heir to a large portion of the Whitmore fortune, wealth that had mysteriously vanished when he disappeared. The documents described Victor as a young man of exceptional promise, an heir to the family's original estate who had been set to inherit it all until he vanished without a trace. The family's story, as Michael remembered it, had always been that Victor was a troubled soul, prone to reckless behavior. But the more he read, the more Michael realized that Victor's disappearance was not a story of self-destruction. It was a story of betrayal. The evidence led him to an old letter, one that had been kept hidden among the family's records. It was a letter from a lawyer detailing Victor's will, which had been revised shortly before his disappearance. The original inheritance had been intended for Victor, but after his mysterious vanishing, the fortune had been redirected, funneled into Edgar's hands. The manipulation was shockingly clear. Edgar, ever the opportunist, had found a way to exploit his cousin's disappearance, turning what was supposed to be Victor's legacy into his own wealth. Michael felt a cold chill spread over him as the realization sank in. Edgar had not only stolen Victor's fortune, but he had likely played a role in the young man's disappearance. There were no solid records of Victor after that final will had been signed, and the way Edgar had quietly taken control of the estate suggested that he knew more about Victor's fate than he let on. Michael's heart pounded as he turned the pages of the documents, his suspicions growing darker with every word. What if Edgar had murdered Victor to ensure that the inheritance went to him? It wasn't just the fortune that had been stolen. It was Victor's life, and perhaps the integrity of the Whitmore name itself. The mansion that Michael had grown up in, the wealth and luxury that had always surrounded him, had been built upon lies and blood. Edgar had constructed his empire not through hard work or merit, but through the deliberate erasure of another man's existence. Michael could no longer ignore the truth. He was standing on the ruins of a stolen legacy, a mansion built on the suffering of a forgotten man. Driven by a need for justice, Michael confronted Edgar, demanding the truth about Victor. Edgar's response was a chilling mixture of dismissal and mockery. He brushed off the allegations, claiming that Victor had simply run off, a wayward relative who had no interest in continuing the family legacy. Michael pressed further, but Edgar's lies became more elaborate, more insistent. He had built his empire on controlling the narrative, and Michael was no longer a part of the story he had carefully crafted. "You have no idea what you're talking about, Michael," Edgar sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "Victor was weak. He was nothing. I did what had to be done to save this family." But Michael knew the truth now. Edgar's wealth was nothing more than a blood-stained illusion. The money, the power, the empire, it had all come at the cost of someone else's life. His uncle's ambition had led him down a path of darkness from which there was no return. The tension between them grew thicker with each passing moment. Michael could feel his pulse quicken as the truth became undeniable. He had to confront his uncle, but in that moment, he understood something else. Edgar's wealth was a prison. No amount of money or power could erase the weight of the betrayal, the deceit that had built everything his uncle held dear. As Michael continued to dig, he discovered one final piece of the puzzle. Hidden away in the family vault, Michael found the letter that would end everything. It was a letter from Victor, written just before he vanished, addressed to his father. In it, Victor revealed the truth about Edgar, the manipulation, the lies, and the fact that he had been forced out of his inheritance. The letter included a final plea for justice, but it was never sent. It had been intercepted, no doubt by Edgar himself. The letter was the final proof that Edgar's actions were not only cruel, but premeditated. His uncle had not only stolen a fortune, but had done so by betraying his own family. Michael understood now that this was the final piece of the Whitmore legacy, the darkest part of their history, and the one that needed to be confronted. The moment of reckoning came when Edgar's world began to crumble. The missing heir, the real Whitmore, returned to claim what was rightfully his. Victor's brother, the surviving relative who had been forced into hiding all those years ago, stepped forward to expose the truth. Edgar's empire, built on manipulation and deceit, was finally collapsing. His downfall was inevitable, and Michael, though scarred by the revelations, knew that this was the price of greed. As Edgar was taken away in the wake of the truth, Michael stood alone in the mansion, watching the storm clouds gather outside the windows. The fortune that had been stolen, the family's legacy tainted by greed and deception, was now in the hands of the rightful heir. But Michael's thoughts were not on the fortune. Instead, they lingered on the price of that wealth. How many lives had been lost to Edgar's ambition? How many others had paid the price for the Whitmore name? As the mansion settled into an eerie silence, Michael finally realized the cost of his family's wealth was far greater than he had ever imagined. In the end, greed had not only stolen a fortune, it had stolen a soul. Story 5. The Mysterious Will. Michael sat in the cold, sterile office of his father's lawyer, feeling the weight of his loss. The sharp, comforting smell of old books and leather chairs did little to ease the heaviness in his chest. His father had been a stern and distant man, and while Michael had never expected a grand inheritance, he had always assumed there would be something, a token of acknowledgement, perhaps, or a reminder of the life they had shared, however minimal it had been. The lawyer, a sharp-looking man with glasses perched on his nose, began to speak. "Mr. Whitmore, I have the will here, and I must inform you that there are certain provisions within it that may come as a surprise to you." Michael's eyes narrowed. He had always thought that his father's estate would pass to him without much dispute. The family had been wealthy, but the fortune wasn't vast by the standards of old money. Still, there had always been a lingering sense of something more, something his father had never fully explained. Now, Michael sat on the edge of the leather chair, uncertain of what was coming next. The lawyer opened the file in front of him and adjusted his glasses. "The first surprise is that your father had some very specific instructions regarding your inheritance. While the majority of his wealth will, of course, be passed to you, there is a portion of his estate that is not as straightforward." Michael leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" The lawyer hesitated before pulling out a piece of paper from the file and laying it in front of Michael. "There is a hidden clause in the will. It seems your father had been in contact with another family, a powerful family, one that is not known to you, and had entered into an agreement with them." Michael blinked, his mind racing. His father, a man of few confidants, had never mentioned any such thing. He had always kept his dealings private, even from his family. But to think that there was an entire hidden chapter of his life, it was unsettling. "Why was I never told about this?" Michael asked, his voice tinged with confusion and frustration. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "It seems your father went to great lengths to keep this secret. The agreement with the other family involves some difficult decisions, and, well, it appears that your inheritance is tied to it." Michael's thoughts scrambled to piece the puzzle together. Who was this mysterious family? What had his father been involved in that would necessitate such secrecy? The lawyer continued, "According to the will, you have also inherited a deed to a property that your father kept hidden from the family, a property outside the city limits. It's located in a secluded area, and it has been mentioned in various correspondences in his files." Michael's heart skipped a beat. He had no knowledge of any hidden property. His father had never once spoken about it, and the thought that there was something he had kept secret for so long was unnerving. The will's provisions were becoming more ominous by the second. "What kind of property?" Michael asked, barely able to keep his voice steady. "It's an old mansion, Mr. Whitmore," the lawyer replied, his tone cautious. "But it's not like any property that you would be familiar with. It seems your father was very careful about its upkeep, but there are unsettling things mentioned in the documents." Michael's mind began to race as he processed the lawyer's words. A secret property? Ties to a powerful family he had never heard of? And most unsettling of all, his father had gone to great lengths to hide it all from him. The pieces of his father's life that Michael had always thought he understood were suddenly shrouded in mystery. And the more he thought about it, the more he felt like he was standing on the edge of a dark and hidden legacy. After a few moments of silence, Michael looked up at the lawyer. "I need to see this property," he said, his voice firm, determined. "I need to understand what this is all about." The lawyer nodded, his expression grave. "I understand, Mr. Whitmore, but I must warn you, the contents of that property may not be what you expect. Your father had reasons for keeping it so well guarded. Michael ignored the lawyer's warning, his mind set on uncovering the truth. There was something about this hidden legacy, something dangerous and important that his father had kept buried. And if Michael was going to fully understand who his father had been and what kind of life he had truly lived, he needed to see it for himself. The mansion was isolated, located deep in the woods, far from the city where Michael had spent most of his life. As Michael approached the property, a sense of foreboding settled in his chest. The mansion loomed ahead, an imposing structure that seemed to have been untouched by time. The overgrown ivy clung to its walls, and the windows, dark and uninviting, stared down at him like the eyes of some long-dead creature. He stepped out of his car, feeling the weight of the air, thick, humid, and filled with the scent of moss and decay. The long driveway was lined with ancient trees whose limbs swayed uneasily in the wind. Michael couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. As he approached the mansion's front door, his hand hesitated on the handle. Something about this place felt wrong, but there was no turning back now. Michael pushed the door open, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with dust and neglect. The walls were adorned with old portraits, their faces obscured by years of grime. But what struck Michael most was the faint smell of something metallic, like old blood. It lingered in the air, just out of reach, making the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He moved cautiously through the mansion, each room darker and more oppressive than the last. Finally, he came upon a hidden study, concealed behind a bookshelf that opened at his touch. The room was small, cramped, and filled with shelves upon shelves of yellowed papers. At the center of the room was an old wooden desk, and as Michael approached it, his eyes were drawn to a large, leather-bound book that rested on top of it. As he flipped through the pages, he discovered the true nature of the pact his father had entered into with the other family. They were a powerful, well-connected group that had dealt in both legitimate and illicit affairs for generations. Michael's father had become involved with them in an effort to secure the family's future, a decision that had come at a great cost. The documents outlined a series of exchanges, the family's support for Michael's father in exchange for future favors that Michael could only imagine the implications of. But there was more. As Michael dug deeper into the book, he found mentions of his father's relationship with someone he had never known existed, a woman, a member of the other family. It seemed that his father had been involved in a secret affair with her. She had been the mother of a child. The child, it turned out, was Michael's half-sibling. The truth of his father's hidden life, the lies he had been fed all these years, was beginning to unravel. The revelation shook Michael to his core. The family's secrets his father had worked so hard to bury were spilling into the light, revealing a legacy tainted by betrayal, deception, and unspoken pacts. Michael had inherited not just the property, but a tangled web of lies and dark family ties that would change everything he thought he knew about his father's life. As the mansion loomed over him, a chilling realization took root in Michael's heart. The inheritance his father had left him was not a gift, but a curse. Michael Whitmore's journey through the tangled web of his family's dark past was never one he could have anticipated. What began as a quest for understanding his father's legacy quickly became a confrontation with betrayals, lost identities, and the inevitability of fate. Each revelation peeled back layers of deceit that his family had so carefully buried, exposing the costs of secrets long kept hidden. The story of Michael's inheritance, whether it was a cursed family heirloom, a stolen fortune, or a cryptic will, is a reflection of a more universal truth. The past, no matter how tightly it is held in the shadows, always finds its way to the surface. From the cursed pocket watch that seemed to guide its owners toward disaster, to the deadly inheritance built on a foundation of greed and treachery, Michael's life became an exploration of the consequences of choices made by others long before his birth. The mysterious and tragic accident involving his birth parents, the shady dealings of his Uncle Edgar, and the devastating truths about his own father's secret life. Each story serves as a powerful reminder that the legacy we inherit is not always one of glory or honor. Sometimes it is one of pain, manipulation, and the consequences of decisions that have been buried so deep they become invisible until they can no longer be denied. As Michael uncovered the truth behind his family's wealth and the dark secrets that shaped his father's legacy, the overwhelming theme that emerged was the inescapable nature of fate. Each misfortune, whether it was the death of a relative, the financial ruin of a loved one, or the destruction of Michael's own peace of mind, was tied to forces beyond his control. The watch, the fortune, the will, each object or document carried with it the power to shape his destiny, but it also carried the burden of a history that Michael could never escape. The past had already chosen its course, and no matter how hard he tried to break free, he found himself ensnared in the same patterns of betrayal and deceit. The cursed heirloom and the mysterious were more than just symbols of family history. They were the embodiment of a powerful truth, that some legacies cannot be rewritten, no matter how much one wishes to rewrite them. Michael was forever linked to a past filled with betrayal and secrets, and the cost of uncovering those truths was steep. The price of uncovering the past was not just knowledge, but also the emotional and psychological toll it took on Michael's very sense of self. Who was he now? After everything he had learned, was he simply a product of his family's dark history? Or could he break free from its suffocating grip? The weight of these revelations was not just a burden for Michael, but for anyone who inherits the legacies of their forebears, be it the wealth, the power, or the mistakes and misdeeds that have been passed down. It is a truth that many of us must face at some point in our lives. We are shaped not only by the choices we make, but also by the choices of those who came before us. The task, then, is not simply to inherit or accept, but to navigate the complex and sometimes painful process of deciding what to do with what we've been given. The stories of Michael's family serve as a reminder that no inheritance, no matter how seemingly innocent or valuable, comes without its cost. In the end, Michael's quest for answers about his father, his family, and his legacy left him with more questions than answers. The mansion, the will, the stolen fortune, these were not the real mysteries. The real mystery lay in how Michael would navigate his own future, now that the truth had been revealed. Would he accept the inevitable, as many before him had? Or would he attempt to break the cycle, to find a new path forward despite the shadow of his family's past? Perhaps that is the true lesson in all of this, that while we may be bound by the past, we are never entirely powerless in shaping our own future. Even in the face of betrayal, even in the face of pain, there is always a choice. And sometimes, the hardest part of inheriting a legacy is deciding whether to carry it forward or leave it behind.